Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome at educational session, which was organized by the International Center for Education about Auschwitz and the Holocaust in collaboration with the Conservation Center of the museum. Today's session concerns conservation challenges in this memorial site. This session is broadcast and interpreted live. I would like to ask Mr. Rafał Pióro, the Deputy Director of the museum. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today, during today's session, we are going to discuss the issues concerning conservations, buildings, and ruins of the former concentration camp. It is the first session out of the three, which will concern archival materials and other objects kept in the museum, because we would like to discuss the care for the museum as the memorial site. And we are going to see the works employing various specialist methods frequently developed for the benefits of our objects. We frequently use the entire experience of the conservation of historic objects as a field, but also we use some solutions applied in industry, usually, for example, in the preservation against corrosion of the material objects, and also during the conservation of the ruins of the gas chambers and crematoriums, and also for the use of various types of software for preparing conservation documents. Today, we selected the topics which show the scale of conservation and diversity of the objects that we are dealing with. Certainly, this is an illustration only of some of our activities. However, I believe that you will find it interesting. We will discuss both comprehensive uh, conservation projects and also the objects that are under the conservation. Uh, and we will also see the methods which will be used not only for documenting the conservation, but also for the management of the entire process of preservation. Let me also add that within the documents that we have prepared, everybody can see what kind of works have been performed, which is especially important because we want to identify the original elements. And as you may guess, this is a frequently asked question. It's worthwhile to underline that the mission of preserving the memorial site was initiated immediately after the war by the survivors, and in 1947, as a result of parliamentary act whose intention was to preserve the former Nazi concentration camp. Uh, and since that moment, entire teams of specialists were aiming at preserving the authenticity of this place. We can show to you how we care for the places and things that already have been preserved, and what we are doing to preserve it as long as it is going to be possible. A few sentences about conservation philosophy. In our work, the starting point is an object that we are looking after. We treat it as a document, as a testimony. Therefore, it is important to treat it individually. And we speak about the preservation conservation. That means the preservation of the traces connected with the history of Auschwitz, which means that we preserve the damage, the cracks, and deformities. We try to make the history of an object legible
ingerencji.
by means of minimizing our interference.
Byśmy
We do not repair objects because in such a case we would speak about restoration and not conservation. And I do hope that works carried out like that
indywidualne
will
doświadczenie,
help the visitors to have their individual experience of Auschwitz, to contact with the materials that have been preserved and the objects that were
szczególnie
related to the operation of Auschwitz. I believe that it is especially important now when the last witnesses of these times are passing away. Certainly, the balance between interference and authenticity must be found. And this means that we must find the solution that makes the rendering objects available possible with preserving its historic character at the same time.
Birkenau
A good example here would be brick barracks from section B1, which will be discussed in one of the presentations. As part of the conservation, the works are divided into current works, which are related directly to the operation of the museum, and comprehensive ones, which have a project formula. So we carry out teams, work in teams which are dedicated, and they perform independently all the works or they supervise external companies. The teams are interdisciplinary and apart from essential involvement, these are mostly conservators,
odpowiedzialne
technicians.
za obsługę księgowo-finansową.
Also, the teams have people responsible for accounting the human resources and finances. Our experience tells us that it is a very effective method of comprehensive conservation projects. Apart from that, I would like to tell you how important it is that the works are carried out with our own resources and also external companies, in this way diversifying the works. And this helps us to preserve the liquidity of the works and their flow. And we were dealing with that for example, during the COVID pandemic or at the beginning of war in Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, a few words about the team which each day takes challenges and tries to find the best possible way for preserving all the relics connected with the operation of the camp. Currently, in the museum, in the conservation section, which is responsible for the preservation of the memorial site, we employ about 130 people. Half of them are involved in current maintenance, whereas the other half work on special projects. These are specialists with various competencies representing diverse fields or industries. These are, for example, engineers or designers working on specific projects. These are also conservators of various materials such as parchment, leather, paper, architecture. These are archaeologists, chemists, geodesy specialists, and also people responsible for greenery. So you will be able to see how diversified and interdisciplinary team it is. The everyday experience gained by the team and their new competences are by all means necessary. They are also unique and also they make a guarantee for working, for preparing the works with compliance with the art of conservation. Let me also mention that building such a team is a long, lengthy process. So we are not able to attract and find all the specialists in the surrounding areas. Moreover, conservators are treated, trained for the conservation of artworks and not for the conservation of the objects of martyrology. That is why it is a difficult process posing an additional challenge. To close, let me say a few words about finances. Annually, on average, to preserve the memorial site, we spent more than 30 million zlotys. Obviously, this depends on additional resources because we try to obtain them. That is why these amounts are sometimes higher. Current works related to the maintenance and operation of the museum are financed from the resources transferred by the Ministry of Culture and National Heritage and also our own budget that we are trying to create. But what is significant, all comprehensive conservation projects are pursued by the museum from the resources given by the foundation, Auschwitz-Birkenau Foundation. This unique financing mechanism will be introduced to you during one of the presentations concerning a global conservation plan. And also, uh, uh, this is this was worked out by the conservators of of the museum. So I do hope that this will be helpful when you are learning detailed uh, mm, detailed information about conservation, and I wish you a fruitful session. Mr. Director, thank you very much for the nice introduction to the session. And now I would like to invite Ms. Jolanta Banaś-Maciaszczyk, who supervises the conservation section in the museum, and she's going to discuss the problems of conservation of the objects in the former Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And now I will try to start my presentation. I hope it works. Can you see my slides? Yes, everything goes fine. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My presentation will be some kind of introductory to the discussion about the conservation problems about the former concentration camp of Auschwitz, and I will also discuss the principles guiding the conservation works in these objects. Concentration camp Auschwitz-Birkenau, it is the largest and the best preserved former German Nazi concentration camp. In order to speak about conservation in a memorial site, we need to list the key moments for the preservation and conservation of the camp. Director mentioned already the creation of the museum in 1947. Another important moment was 1979, when the museum was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. Another important date is 1995, when the area, the grounds, and the objects were included inscribed in the register of Polish historic monuments. They were under the protection. And 1999 was when the act on the protection about the areas of the former Nazi death camps came into life, and this also includes the grounds of former Auschwitz.
The memorial today extends over two parts of the former camp, Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II-Birkenau, altogether covering 197 hectares, while the former Auschwitz I is 20 hectares and former Auschwitz II-Birkenau is 171 hectares. The largest conservation challenge is the number and the variety of sites and objects on the premises of the camp. We have 175 historical buildings, more than 300 ruins, including guest chambers and crematoria, nearly 14 kilometers of fencing, roads, ditches, railway ramp, and also historical greenery. The former KL Auschwitz are mostly masonry buildings made of brick. For the inmates, we see them top left. There are also wooden sheds, barracks, and guard towers, and the historical fencing and roads. The extant developments in Birkenau consist mostly of wooden and masonry barracks. Wooden are present primarily at the B2 section, at the former quarantine section, and they are of the stable type. They are very characteristic in the landscape of the former camp. There are 27 preserved guard towers around. In the photo, we can see the former hospital barrack. This is the only one in this construction type. They were present here formerly. In B1 section, there are 45 masonry buildings of various functions. Some were residential, there were 30 of those. There were also sanitary ones, baths, kitchens, and also one that functioned as a warehouse while the camp was operating. Obviously, the most important sites connected to the process of mass murder are the guest chambers and crematoria. These are ruins in Birkenau. The ruins of 4 such sites have been preserved. A very important element in this landscape are also relics of the non-extant wooden barracks. Their presence is a proof to the scale of the former camp, where just in B1 section, nearly 200 wooden buildings were built. By now, around 210 relics of the no longer extant wooden barracks still stand. Former Auschwitz II-Birkenau are also fencings, dewatering ditches, and also pumping station and sediment collection. All that is a building infrastructure that in the past was necessary for the camp to function. Greenery is also a very important element of the historical landscape, and we protect and conserve it. In the photographs, you can see some areas where historical greenery plays special role, and this includes, for example, the area of Arbeitmacht Frei gate. There's a historical birch growing here. Below we see the birch alley. Center bottom, it's Hesse's garden. In turn, these are the historical oaks at the hospital section in Birkenau. And obviously, in Brzezinka, we need to show those huge forested areas, especially characteristic of the area around ruins of crematoria 4 and 5. Let us now pass on to the discussion of the most important steps, thanks to which we've managed to retain the historical sites to this day. The key moment came immediately after the liberation of the camp and conclusion of the war. The priority was to finish everything that was there in the camp, and a huge role was played there by the former inmates. The first wrap-up of the conservation needs and were conducted in the 50s and 60s. In 1958, the conservation plan was developed, which made it possible to obtain substantial financing that was fully earmarked to saving the former buildings, or buildings of the former camp. Time has shown that this was especially important as, thanks to this, numerous sites could live till this day. The work on the buildings of the proper camp continues for decades. Another important moment were the 1990s, when the museum received substantial financial support from numerous European states and also various foundations. These funds were used for the most burning conservation practices on buildings, barracks, and also fencing of the former camp. Another important moment in the history of conservation of this museum memorial was setting up a modern conservation facilities, that's the labs, and a cooperation with professionals. These steps made it possible to learn what the condition of the remnants of the camp are, as well as define the main conservation priorities for the years to come. From now on, the complex conservation work conducted on project basis becomes particularly important. On the right-hand side, you can see covers of folders that wrap up the most important conservation projects that were completed. Now I'd like to address a few words about the principles that we follow, our lodestars, while we run the actual conservation. Basically, this is done with the use of universal principles of conservation ethique and the regular conservation methods. However, we stand out in the treatment of the site as a legacy of history, a document of history. In practice, this means that particular principles are adjusted. And may I now use specific projects completed to describe those for you. First, we assume that all the works planned should be subjected to the lodestar of the historical significance of the space, and it is done with respect to the historical substance. That's Auschwitz I. This is after the state after conservation, after all construction work that was necessary to protect the building, and also related to the introduction of new installations. What I want to emphasize is the fact that the building hasn't changed after the completion of the works. Practically, it hardly differs when compared to the pre-conservation condition. Of great importance for us is only to carry out the works that are necessary to protect and to keep the site. We call such conservation technical. These are examples of carrying out various conservation works in various types of premises, where such an approach to them is highly legible. At the top, you can see the inside of the kitchens after conservation. Bottom photo, on the other hand, shows one of the rooms, a room that has been preserved in the ruins of the crematorium number 3, and a section of the wall of the masonry barrack. In consequence, quite a natural consequence of carrying out technical conservation is limiting all the activities of aesthetic nature. And you can see it very well in the photos that you can see at the moment. On the left-hand side, you can see the corridor of the reservation block, where there are certain lacunae in the painting tissue, and on the right-hand side, the inside of a wooden barrack, and we can see that the cover of the latrines has not been filled in while carrying out the works, because there was no such technical need. The following principle that we follow while working here is to make more legible the phase when the camp was in use, of course, if this is possible. On the left-hand side, we see the washing room of block number 2, where during the works, we've identified and discovered some wall paintings from the time when the camp was in operation. While on the right-hand side, we see the effects of the works connected to the chimney, where the historical layers were removed, and in this way we brought back the original color range of those places. During the works, we also assume that an exchange of historical elements can only take place when their condition is a threat to the site and when there are no technical options for proper reinforcement or buttressing of the site. At any price, we try to preserve the historical elements. The photos here show elements in poor technical conditions, which could be preserved thanks to reinforcement and protection. The following question I would like to address for you is the principle that says that when we introduce new elements, we do it so as to be able to differentiate them from the originals. Here on the left-hand side, you can see a fill-in that was necessary as the construction of that tile stove was unstable. It was made so that it did not mimic the original, and on the right-hand side, there is this concrete floor in Brzezinka, which was also completed, and we use the same principle in this case. Right, what is very important while we work is the skillful and well thought through introduction of new elements and new installations into the premises. Our rule is that they must be adjusted to the site and not the other way around, which means we try to use the natural values of what we have so that all the new elements run through those. Here you can see the installation of heating at the top photographs. That was installed in the space of historical floors. On the left-hand side, you can see some historical draining pipes, which were used for heating the former toilets. bottom right, the interior of a wooden barrack, to which the systems for protection, for fire protection were introduced.
Because of the documentary value of the objects, it is of utmost importance to carry out very detailed documentary works and documentation and reports concerning these works, which are gathered consistently during the entire period of conservation works. And then there is a detailed report, post-conservation report. And now we see the photographs of diverse objects and buildings and the reports concerning the works in progress and the condition and the current condition of a document. Speaking about conservation in a memorial site, we mean all the processes which allow us to preserve the historic objects as long as it is possible. In case of conservation of buildings, we are not speaking only about conservation because there are many comprehensive works and the whole process includes also construction and conservation works. We frequently say that conservation is an interdisciplinary process which must be carried out by specialists of diverse fields, and only such actions which complete each other and which are intertwined together guarantee historical protection of the buildings. Speaking about conservation and preservation and the grounds of the former camp, we can distinguish three scopes of actions. The first one is research and documentation. The second one is prophylactic preventing actions and current maintenance, whilst the third is comprehensive maintenance and documentation. Documentation and conservation. Documentation is carried out independently from conservation because documentary works register the condition of a building at a given moment, whereas the research helps us to learn the condition of the building and its history. And the research is also the foundation for further works to establish the programs and agendas of conservatory works, and then which guarantee the correct schedule of the works. As you see in the photographs which are presented here in the slides, apart from the documentation of buildings, which is made with the use of various techniques, these documents are used for the collection of data of a historic place and also concerning the building. You can see for example, the Birch Alley of the camp. What is really important here of our acts are the current maintenance works. The buildings require an ongoing supervision, and thanks to that, they can last in time and also be rendered valuable to the museum visitors. That is why an important scope of works is so-called preventive maintenance or preventive conservation, which is related to the monitoring of all the objects. So the example of such works can be seen here in the photographs. On the left-hand side, you see conservation works concerning window woodwork and the condition before the conservation and after the conservation presented below, whereas on the right-hand side of the slide, you see the photographs documenting conservation works concerning painting layers in the cellars of block number 18, which were preserved in a very poor condition, which you can see in the photograph in the middle, and therefore they require urgent protection. And these are next examples of intervention works which are performed in buildings of all types. The last scope of conservation actions that I mentioned are comprehensive conservation projects. Project works are performed mainly within the Global Conservation Plan, thanks to the support of the foundation, Auschwitz-Birkenau Foundation, and these projects will be discussed in the next presentation today. Thank you very much for your attention.